As a survivor of spiritual abuse or any other types of abuse, it's really important that you are on your guard against certain types of emotional responses that can put you at risk for further abuse or continued abuse. And I'm going to talk about one of those today. My name is Dr. Felucia, and I'm a licensed psychologist. And in my practice, I focus on the treatment of different things. One of them is OCD, and another one is spiritual abuse, which I'll be talking about today. So, back to the topic at hand. Um, what are some of the emotional responses that you have to be on guard against? One of them is the emotional response of pity. Now, I'm not saying it is bad to have pity, but when we have pity on other people, especially those who are abusive, it can put us at risk for further abuse. And so I'm going to talk about what pity is and how I construe it um, from this perspective. There's nothing wrong with feeling sorry for somebody. There's nothing wrong with empathy or compassion. But when we are engaging in pity, I would argue that there's probably more of an emotional distance. And so when we're looking at that person with the eyes of pity, we almost view them or construe them as less capable of doing certain things and going through certain hardships. And so, I'll hear this question often from people who have been through abuse, and they'll want to know, well, what if this person like is not capable of being loving, or what if this person is not capable of not being abusive? There are all these questions that tend to run through somebody's mind when they're going through something like this, which is understandable. The issue is that when we start to look at people as less capable, then it puts us at risk for various reasons. The first reason is that it causes us to have differing standards, right? So if you're not going to accept something from yourself, then why would you accept that from someone else, right? And so, when you are going through this feeling of pity for somebody who is abusive, all these things come into play. And it's almost as if you feel like, well, this person is not capable of acting in a way that is non-harmful, right? And it's not just you that's thinking this. I mean, we live I think that there's some things that are wrong with our society. And sometimes, and one of those things is how we construe and think about people who harm others. And a lot of times there's always has to be this explanation as to why they did it. They had a rough childhood. They have this thing wrong with them. They have that thing wrong with them. And so a lot of times in our quest to explain why somebody would harm somebody else, we want to attach excuses to that and almost like a way out for that person to accept responsibility, right? So there's this myth that people who are bullies, have these awful childhoods and they have all these bad things happening to them at home. And so they're like acting out and, they're just hurt people, right? It goes back to like the hurt people thing that I've talked about before on this channel and how that's a myth. It's the same idea here with this pity thing or looking at bullies as people who are just hurt. It minimizes, number one, the harm that they do. And number two, it also makes them less capable, right? And we have to understand that we are all capable of various things. And so the fact that you wouldn't do something doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else wouldn't do it, but at the same time, they have the same choices available to them as you do. And so we have to start looking at things differently and understand that people are capable of change. People do have the capacity to act in ways that don't harm other people. And so I want you to think about that because oftentimes when we start to look at people through the eyes of pity, especially people who have harmed or abused us, it can cause us to start making excuses for what they did. And then when we start making excuses for what they did, then now what they did is somehow justifiable to us. And you might think, well, that's strange. If you've been harmed by somebody, why would you try to justify what they did? But we do that because I believe deep down inside, we all want to be able to know and understand why something happened. And I tell people, when we're working through recovery from spiritual abuse, that you will probably never know the full reason, or you will never have a why for why people do what they do. I'm more concerned about you getting the healing you need than for you to figure that out. And so the first danger of having pity is double standards, right? And we don't want to have double standards. We can have different expectations. We are probably going to hold ourselves to higher expectations than we do for other people, and that's fine. But we also have to understand that people make choices. And just because somebody is abusive doesn't mean that they're somehow less capable of doing the right thing. The second thing about pity is that it causes us to, it kind of dovetails with the first one, but to somehow balance scales that we see as unequal. And so when we look at somebody who is abusive, or we look at a system that's abusive, and we start to engage from this perspective of pity, what that causes us to do is we start feeling, well, I need to balance the scale somehow, right? There might be an abusive person in power who talks a lot about having a rough childhood or having very difficult interpersonal experiences. And so when you hear that, and when you hear that, you're conditioned to now balance the scales or to somehow defend this person. We had talked about this in our live stream a few months ago, and somebody brought up a really good point that they've noticed that people who are abusive spiritual leaders tend to kind of get ahead of the narrative about themselves, and they talk about things in such a way where you feel tempted to defend them, preemptively defend them against anybody that might say that they're not doing what they're supposed to do or whatnot. And they do this through sometimes telling stories about their childhood. They might also do this through just talking about difficult experiences they've had. And so when you look at somebody who was abusive through this lens of pity, and then you're tempted to balance the scales, well, what's that going to look like? The scales are already, first of all, imbalanced because of the power dynamic, the power differential, rather, excuse me, the power differential between you and that leader, right? Because they're at a place of authority and leadership over you. And so there's that. And then you are now working against your best interest by trying to balance that scale and say, well, they've had all these difficult things happen to them, so I'm not going to blow the whistle on this harmful thing that they did or that they're doing. And so we're trying to basically balance the scales. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing. When we are in situations like this, we're supposed to protect and defend ourselves, not make excuses for abusive behavior. It is the abuser's responsibility to do their own inner work and to do their own recovery and healing. When we now say, well, we have to balance the scales because we feel sorry for them and we feel pity for them, it is actually putting us at a disadvantage. And again, that might be driven too by a desire to not seem like a bad person. I notice that this is something that comes up a lot in my work with spiritual abuse survivors or any sort of abuse, right? When that happens, we feel very, the word is like, I guess, kind of obligated to not be another bad person, right? So there's this person that's harmed us. And so now we want to make sure that we are being a good person. And we do this by, giving them a pass through pity, right? And so think about that. And I want you to think about a time maybe when you've been tempted to do that. I think we all have been in situations where we feel like we have to give somebody either a pass or balance the scales, even against our favor. So that's the second part, that's the second thing to watch out for. And then the third thing to watch out for is that when we pity people, we tend to lower our guard around them. And when you think about your recovery from abuse, that's the last thing you want to be doing. You don't want to be giving anybody free passes. You don't want to be lowering your guard around anybody. And a lot of people don't like hearing that because they think, well, am I supposed to be paranoid forever? There's a difference between being guarded and being paranoid. And I would argue that anybody who has been through spiritual trauma, spiritual abuse, or any other type of abuse is going to have a difficult time letting their guard down. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I believe that you have the right to keep your guard up for as long as you want. And I also talk about this too, is that we don't want to just have people earn our trust. They have to maintain it. They have to keep working for that trust to show that they are trustworthy people. So that is where the not letting your guard down part happens. You see what I mean? So if you have somebody that you trust, it's not just a one-time thing. They have to continue to show that they can be trusted. And so when you have pity for somebody, you will lower your guard around them. You will let your guard down. And what that does is it opens you up for even more abuse, either from somebody who is a current perpetrator or somebody who could be a perpetrator. And so that's why, as somebody as somebody who's been through abuse, you want to make sure that you are you don't let your guard down. You can have compassion for somebody, you can have empathy for somebody, you can look at somebody's situation and feel sad for them, but you don't want to let your guard down. You don't want to have double standards for yourself and other people, and you don't want to try and balance the scales. You're not your place to do that. Okay. So I hope this information helps you. I'd also like to hear from you in the comment section. Have you ever struggled with feeling pity toward, an abusive person, or anything like that? And how did you manage that? If you do find yourself in the space of feeling pity, I don't want you to feel ashamed of that. Um, it's not something to feel bad about, beat yourself up about. It's just something to be aware of, because I would even argue that you can feel pity for somebody without doing those three things. So you can feel pity, but just make sure you understand, number one, that person's capable. They're more capable than you're giving them credit for. And number two, you don't have to balance any scales or make things fair, because there's already an imbalance because you went through abuse and you shouldn't have had to go through that. It's not fair. And then number three, you don't want to let your guard down. So you can learn, through therapy and through other things, to feel bad for somebody, but at the same time, protect yourself. And so if you want, let me know in the comment section and I can do a video on that as well. So I hope you have a wonderful day. If you want to book a consultation with me, you can go to my website, skillsetcounseling.com, click on the orange button for a free consultation. There's also a link in the description box that you can do that. So I hope you have a wonderful day that's filled with peace. Bye-bye.